Activation and discretion warning. This episode contains explicit and graphic descriptions of attempted suicide, physical assault, and adult content situations, including sexual assault and rape. Discretionary caution and action is required. This episode is not for children. Please use extreme self-care in listening to this episode and seek immediate help through the National Suicide Hotline by dialing 988 if you are emotionally activated or triggered by the content of this episode. Or if you are activated and need help from the National Sexual Assault Telephone Hotline, call 1-800-656-HOPE. That's 1-800-656-4673.
I knew that I'd been trafficked to doctors. I knew that there was sexual abuse within the community too, with some people that owned land. But what I remembered that day was that there was a time, I don't know how many times, but at least once, that men paid to literally hunt me in the woods, to violently rape me. And that's what happened. After I was assaulted in the woods, after this hunt, I came down to my dad's house where I was punished for that happening to me, even though he had sold me. And I was sequestered to my room, my bedroom. I wasn't allowed to eat or drink because I was being punished. And I remember just peeking my head out to run to the bathroom that would be right next door to my bedroom.
Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Hey, SAS listeners. Welcome back. This is episode 81, and I am super fortunate to have in the studio with me Cassie Nicholas. Cassie, if you remember, is a former guest on this show. I just looked, and episode 36 is the last time Cassie was with me back in June of 23, so it's been almost a year now.
A lot has happened.
Yeah, it has. Cassie, welcome to the studio. I'm glad you're here.
I'm so excited to be here.
It's not often that I'm fortunate enough to have one of my guests actually in the studio, but Cassie's in the area for a while, contacted me and said, hey, I'm here. And I'm like, oh, good, because we need to do another episode.
Yes.
And let's do it in the studio since you're close. And she agreed. So thank you for being here.
I'm so excited. Thank you for having
awesome.
me. Yeah.
I did. I told the audience even way back then that you and I would sit down and do a follow-up someday. And much like you just said, has changed. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about some of the things that Cassie and I have been talking about just over the last day or so in our conversations and getting ready for this. Cassie has experienced some new memories from her childhood sexual assault, which
Correct.
is not uncommon. Cassie's going to talk to us about some of that. Cassie?
All right. I'd like to start with a brief recap of some high points of my story, which is I'm from West Virginia. I'm from the southern part, a very rural area. And as a child, my father was trafficking myself and my sister, who was completely disabled physically and mentally, to doctors in the area and to some other people who were landowners and such in the area. My mother found out and she was murdered by my father. She was a great mother. She tried to get away and she could not. So this is something that I watched. I did not understand exactly what had happened to her until about 2 years ago, when I barely escaped a domestic abuse situation myself under very similar circumstances. And part of the reason that I want to share my story and give an update is because I'm really passionate in showing that the things that happened to me as a child don't stop. And often we get caught in systems. I was caught in generational poverty, generational trauma, with no guidance, no adults to help me. No one knew what was happening. And so I grew up, I lived I'm almost 41 now, 39 years of my life severely depressed, thinking that there was something wrong with me. And I was so intelligent. I excelled in school and academics and work. I was a hard worker. I had no idea what had happened to me. I had no idea what had happened to my mother or my sister until I nearly died from domestic abuse. And so all of those things just keep giving from childhood. And we, I think, tend to stop listening to survivor stories once they get out and once they start to heal. But the fact is, the road to actually being stable again after all of these sexual assaults, it's not a straight line at all. And there are a lot of complications and a lot of difficulties that I think we forget to watch. We forget to listen to what happens after someone tells their story.
I think that's critical to point out. I'm glad you brought that up. Remind the audience too, Cassie, if you would, how long were you in that domestic violence relationship?
Sure. I was with my ex-wife for 10 years. I had met her in college in 2001. And at the time when I met her, I had left my dad's house. I had full dissociative amnesia. I did not remember the trafficking or anything like that. And so when I got to college, I started to take control of my health, of my body, of all these things. And I got really in shape. And that's when I met my ex-wife. My ex-wife had been body shamed by her mother. It was a very abusive household. I understand why she became who she became, but that is impact versus intention. And so the impact on me is what's important. And so she was in a larger body because of things that had happened to her, because of her mom, and her mom had fat shamed her and all of these things. And she saw me as someone with confidence who used to have a different body. And she hated that. And she told me that she hated me 10 years later when we got together. And I laughed. But the thing is, when people say things like that, you should listen.
Right. And I'm guessing that the way she said it was kind of in a jovial, joking kind of, oh, I hate you.
Yes.
Kind of thing. Is that what I'm interpreting?
Yes. She said, I hated you. You were so conceited. And one thing that I've never been is conceited. I don't have enough confidence to be conceited, especially then.
Quite the observation on your part to recognize that she's calling you something that you absolutely weren't, and the projection often that goes into those kind of comments, and being able to recognize that that's probably where that came from.
Yes, absolutely. And so she had that hate towards me. And my sister allegedly had a birth injury. The doctor allegedly was intoxicated when he delivered her, although I've found other information that suggests otherwise at this point. And so there was $1 million lawsuit, and my sister had $1 million in the bank. Now, I've never been impressed by money, partially because I grew up very poor in West Virginia. My family was very poor, but I didn't know it because we had trafficking money. So I never felt the poverty. It wasn't until 2022 when I applied for student loan forgiveness that I saw I had $20,000 in Pell Grants. And I thought, what? What are Pell Grants? And I looked it up and saw how impoverished you need to be to get them. But I grew up with a swimming pool, an RV, all these different things. I had no idea, except that I saw my family around me living in the hollers of West Virginia in poverty. So I never thought anything about money. I never thought that $1 million was that much money. So I talked about it openly. I never thought someone would try to kill me to get to my sister and her money. And that is what happened with my ex-wife.
And I think we talked about some of that in the first episode, if I'm right.
A little bit, but I still wasn't fully understanding that she had made me sick. I don't know if I didn't know or if I just wasn't ready to embrace it, or a little bit of both, perhaps.
Well, obviously, and we've talked a lot about traumatic amnesia, but also just the whole dissociative state and how that can interfere with the making of memory. It may seem foggy and unclear for a while or forever. You've gotten some clarity, though, through the past year.
Absolutely. I think I'm going to start by going back to my childhood now, and then I'll go back to the situation with my ex-wife and give an update, because you'll see how one led to the other.
And how interrelated they are. Yes. Yeah.
Over the winter, I was actually in Oregon for a few months. And while I was there, I was in the woods, in nature, in seclusion most of the time. And for me, those are the moments when the awareness of my traumatic memories usually come in. That's how it happened the first time. I was still married, and my ex-wife left town for a night. And that's when the initial memories, or the awareness of the memories and the dots connecting, came in about my trafficking as a child. And so when I was in Oregon this winter, I had a flashback. Someone was working on the property and the road was blocked, and I couldn't get off the property where I was staying with some other people. And I went into a flashback that was different from my normal complex PTSD flashbacks. Sometimes when I have a PTSD flashback, it's more like I'll just forget where I am for a moment, and I'll go, oh my gosh, am I here, or am I in this place from the past? This was different in that I looked up and I saw trees, and I immediately thought the woods weren't always safe, which is strange for me because I grew up in the woods. The woods raised me. That was my escape. I was always in nature, playing in the creek, all of these things. And suddenly I couldn't tell if I was in Oregon or if I was in West Virginia. And because I've been psychologically tortured by my father, by friends, and by my ex-wife, I knew to ground myself. And I looked up and I said, Cassie, these are tall evergreen trees. In West Virginia, we have sycamore trees. We have these other types of trees. These are all evergreens. You're safe. And I was able to ground myself. But that moment precipitated one of the most horrendous memories that I had. And I've actually learned since then that this is not atypical for trafficking victims of childhood. I knew that I'd been trafficked to doctors. I knew that there was sexual abuse within the community too, with some people that owned land. But what I remembered that day was that there was a time, I don't know how many times, but at least once, that men paid to literally hunt me in the woods, to violently rape me. And that's what happened. After I was assaulted in the woods after this hunt, I came down to my dad's house where I was punished for that happening to me, even though he had sold me. And I was sequestered to my room, my bedroom. I wasn't allowed to eat or drink because I was being punished. And I remember just peeking my head out to run to the bathroom that would be right next door to my bedroom. This specific situation would lead into one of the most horrific situations in my marriage, which was the silent treatment that happened constantly, usually when I was the sickest. Specifically towards the end of my marriage, when I was dying, I almost didn't make it. And my ex-wife would be angry with me, and I would almost take myself into the bedroom, just like as a child. I would sequester myself. I wouldn't eat. I wouldn't drink. I would only peek my head out to run to the bathroom. And I remember my ex-wife sitting in a recliner. She would turn off all the sound, all the lights, and just stare at me. And this would go on for days. And I realize now, after the awareness of that memory dropped in, that I was reliving my childhood, that situation, over and over. And my ex-wife really didn't even have to do any work. She didn't even know about it. But she was effectively recreating something because she knew how to read my triggers. She knew how to read the things that were happening to me. And she was effectively recreating this traumatic situation over and over again.
Even though she didn't know what that trauma was, she saw signals in you that you were activated.
Yes.
And therefore exploited those and started doing what?
She started taking actions that she saw would activate me, or she would feed on it. People who are survivors and people who abuse both are often created from trauma.
Yes.
People who survive have that hypervigilance. We learn to read others. We learn to read our environment. We learn to read our situation, but so do people who are perpetrators. Mm-hmm. And it just is applied differently.
It's so interesting you brought that up. I know that there are studies out there that say that one of the biggest predictors that someone is going to be sexually assaulted is that they've been sexually assaulted in the past. That begs the question then, how do perpetrators know who's been sexually assaulted in the past without talking to someone and getting a full history? How is it that they can pick up on somebody's past experience of being sexually assaulted and recognize their vulnerabilities and their body languages to know that they're sexually assaulted? That's a whole science in and of itself, but we do know that's true. I think that's what you're talking about very specifically, is that certain things that you might have been going through in your daily life that were outward manifestations of your past, of sexual abuse or physical abuse or emotional traumas that you had gone through with your dad, and even knowing that you had a disabled sister and a mom who was trying to do her best to manage all of this, all had an impact. So obviously that's going to feed into your behavioral patterns as an adult, and someone who is looking for vulnerabilities is going to pick up on that. Absolutely. Am I on the right track with everything that I'm talking about?
Yes, spot on. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I have observed this type of almost reading by people who abuse in several other situations since then. And my observation is that it's less about them observing the trigger and more about them just observing your reaction. And then they learn to elicit that again and again and again until they break you. I can only speak for myself, but for me, I was unaware of how much danger I was in as a child. If my baseline for danger is being trafficked, and I don't even know I've been trafficked, I'm not saying I'm putting myself in bad situations, but you surround yourself by things that feel familiar. And I had no baseline for what danger was. So looking through my life, this is another thing that happened in Oregon. That danger, that sense of danger just dropped into my awareness. And it was so heavy to realize that I had been surrounded by people who wanted to hurt me my entire life, who did hurt me my entire life. If you don't understand what danger is, you're going to be in those situations over and over and over again until you figure it out, unfortunately.
You don't know what you don't know.
Exactly.
Cassie, let's retrace some of that memory itself, the actual memory of being hunted.
Yes.
That's atrocious and horrific and mind-boggling in and of itself if you're not someone who is aware of the dynamics of childhood sexual abuse and assault and rape. The fact that your father, who was supposed to be your protector, your caregiver, someone who loved you and wanted the best for you in life, is actually profiting off of your body and your existence. I want to talk about that more because that's another topic in and of itself. But that specific memory, like you said, you don't know if there were other episodes of being hunted, but that particular one that you do remember, can you help us understand more about what that experience was like? For instance, one of the things that comes to mind that I'd like some specificity on is how old you were and whether you knew at the time that it was happening that your dad had put you in that situation for his profit.
I was in 6th grade. And actually, I'm glad you asked that question because the way that I remembered and connected the dots back is actually, it involves a form of dissociation. So I don't know if I was aware at the time, but the way that I connected the dots back is there was a moment in 6th grade. I was the captain of the patrol team. I remember going to the 6th grade bathroom in the hallway. In dissociation, there is something called, and I get the two confused, depersonalization or derealization. And it is basically where you quote unquote leave your body because your mind and your body split. Your mind has to go somewhere else so your body can endure the abuse. And you don't always drop back into your body immediately. Sometimes it is extended. And so this day I remember being in the bathroom and all of a sudden realizing that my genitals hurt horribly. And it was the worst pain ever. And there was nothing I could do. I couldn't say anything to anybody. I couldn't ask for help. And I remember trying to deal with that. And that is how I connected the dots back to the hunting. It was the result of the hunting, and I was in 6th grade, so I was about 12 years old.
And you said it was a violent rape.
Yes.
Which would, of course, precipitate the pain.
Correct.
Of a horrific, painful rape.
Yes. Yes.
Do you have specific memory of that episode?
No, I don't. So the way that my dissociative amnesia works, and I'm grateful for this, is that, first of all, I'm only given as much as my body can take, because when that drops into my mind, into my awareness, your nervous system is activated. All of these things are happening. So the brain is so smart and it only gives me as much as I can handle at a time. So I don't have specific memories about any of my assaults from childhood. It's almost like a door closes. I see the people, I see the characters, I'm aware of what happened, but I don't see the details, which thank God.
I think there's a fortunate aspect to that, as you're mentioning, but there's also the unfortunate aspect for some of my listeners who have been in situations like that, where they want to remember specifics about their rapes or sexual assaults because it would help fill in some of the blanks as to how they got there or what they did during or what they did immediately after. And I've talked about this in previous episodes, those episodic memories and the way, as I just mentioned a minute ago, how trauma can interfere with formulation of those memories. Some of those memories will never come back, and some of those memories won't go away. You can try your hardest to make them go away, and they won't, and they intrude and become intrusive memories at the least suspected time that they would, and sometimes in the most inconvenient times in our lives. And I'm mentioning all of this and thankful for your willingness to talk about it because I know there are listeners in this audience who have been through similar circumstances, even down to the aspect of being hunted, being trafficked. Your willingness to be transparent about that and bring it to light and talk about it in this way is so commendable. It takes a lot of strength because it does bring up so much. And we've talked about that too, and what we'll do in terms of how we're going to take care of ourselves after we've been through a situation where we're talking about such horrific memories. So thank you for doing this.
My entire goal of speaking out is I want to help adults, of course, but it's more about raising awareness so that there aren't little Cassies, that there are fewer little Cassies suffering alone, that adults can actually start to see the signs and to start to pick up on it. Because this should not be happening to children. So I'm happy to share my story. I am happy to use my pain. I hate that it happened, but.
So do I. And I'm, from the bottom of my heart, terribly sorry for the experiences that you've had that brings you into this studio and onto this platform.
Thank you.
Eternally grateful and feel a deep sense of gratitude for your presence here and your willingness to share. As I do with all my guests, I say this lots of times. There seems to be a camaraderie, a community of victims and survivors who say, I hate being part of this community. I wish I wasn't because of my traumas, but I'm also thankful that I am, because it's turned me into who I am today. It's made me realize so much about myself and how fortunate I am to have survived those situations. And I'm in a place where I can actually tell other people about it, and they can not only gain some understanding of what they themselves may be going through, but also help others and help ultimately lessen the prevalence rate of rape and sexual assault, not only with children, but also adults.
Yes, of course.
So thank you, thank you, thank you.
You're so welcome.
Cassie, can you tell us more about that realization when you were trying to get out of that property and you were blocked from doing so, had this realization that you had been traumatized in the woods? You recognized that you were going into a dissociative state, and you mentioned it a little bit just now about what you did to ground yourself.
Yes.
Talk about how you recognized that you needed to be grounding, how you knew what grounding was, and what you did to actually ground yourself.
Sure. So it's a multi-layered answer. So after I escaped domestic abuse in 2022, I didn't have money. She cut off my access to money. She cut off my access to medication. I haven't had therapy for most of 2 years. I haven't had access to it. So I've had to learn ways to do it myself to facilitate my own healing. When I got out, I started meditating for the breathing, for calming the nervous system. I started learning about grounding there, learning to use my senses to understand that I am in the present, to understand that I am not in a flashback. So what can I see? What can I hear? What can I smell? What can I taste? Those sorts of things. I learned about that. And so that was the foundation for this. Unfortunately, since I've left, there are a lot of people who are predatory, who look for people who have survived certain things like me, like a lot of us. They sense it. I found that a lot of survivors of childhood trauma have this like childlike wonder and awe, and they want to trust people. We want to trust people because we were trapped as children. We had no way out. And so we are hoping that someone will see us and someone will help. It had such awe and such wonder and such trust, almost to being naive. And people can read that on you. And one of the people who read that on me was someone that I've known since second grade. I was sleeping in my car in Frederick, Maryland, and this person was a doctor of psychology in South Florida. And she reached out and she said, come stay with me. My husband and I will support you. She and her husband are both from my hometown. She said, come down to South Florida. We'll support you. We'll do this. We'll do that. We'll help you get all of your things more legal, your car. We'll help you get a job, all these things. So I let her rewrite history because I was in a state of desperation. What really happened was she was not a friend since second grade. She was actually the only bully that I've ever had. But again, she seemed nice. She had a doctorate of psychology. She was allegedly trauma informed. So she was reflecting back to me the things that made sense. So I drove to Florida, and it was pretty quick that I realized that things were not as they seemed, and that this person was actually a communal narcissist. Unfortunately, when I remembered what my dad had done to me, she was the first person that I messaged. This was about a year before I went to Florida. And I messaged her to make sure my dad didn't hurt her. And instead of, responding and hearing my story, she saw an opportunity to exploit. And what communal narcissists do is they use things like charity, do-gooder attitudes to actually get attention themselves. It's not about helping a person. It's about exploiting a person's story to gain notoriety themselves. And she saw me, someone with a big personality, someone with a following on TikTok. She saw me as a good public speaker, and she saw me with a heck of a story. And I started to see things degrade very quickly. And after about a month or a month and a half, I knew what had happened, but I was stuck because resources had been pulled. I wasn't able to get new resources. One of the things that I learned to ground myself is I saw her abusing her husband covertly, just like she was abusing me through things like microaggressions, through things like psychological torture. And sometimes the things that people do when they do these sorts of things make no sense, but it's just to break you. And so one of the first things she did was start gaslighting me about the temperature of the house. She liked the house really hot. It was South Florida, humid, hot. And her husband liked it cool. Her husband worked all day and she would turn the AC up. I would sit in my room, which was in a sunny window, and I had started sweating one day when he was out of town and I was just drenched in sweat. And I was like, is it hot in here? And she said, oh, no, it's not hot. She kept gaslighting me about the temperature. And she said, you're just in menopause or you're really sick. Now I have medical PTSD for very obvious reasons, not just the childhood trafficking to doctors, but also being in the medical system for 10 years while my ex-wife was poisoning me and I was looking for a mystery diagnosis. And this woman, this psychologist, doctor of psychology, knew that. I had readily given her a blueprint to all of my triggers, to all of my trauma. I had told her exactly how my ex-wife tried to kill me. And so she knew all of my triggers. She knew everything and how to work it. So she tried to use the temperature of the house to start to psychologically break me. I think my intuition was starting to kind of develop. I was starting to trust myself. My nervous system had calmed down. You know, it had been about a year since I escaped abuse and it had started to calm down, but I knew something was off. I use coconut oil as a moisturizer, and I happen to know the melting point of coconut oil is, I think it's 76 or 77 degrees. I knew at the time. And I noticed that it would melt when her husband was at work, and when he was home, it was completely solid. And so I grounded myself to the reality of my environment using the melting point of coconut oil. My father, I'm not a therapist or anything like that, but I think it's pretty clear that he had some kind of psychopathy. And I had started to deconstruct from psychopathy. So it's hard to get things by me at this point. I might not be a great read of character sometimes, but once I see things, it's easy to see. And so that was basically the long answer of how I started to ground myself to reality. You use your senses, you use the things that you know about your environment to stay in touch with reality. During flashbacks or during active abuse, active torture, it's something that can keep you safe, mentally, emotionally, safer, I should say.
How effective do you feel it is?
In that situation, it was greatly effective. Now, I had about a year of healing under my belt, so I had kind of developed some of this. I had flexed those muscles because it is like a muscle. The more you do it, the easier it gets, the quicker you are at picking up things in your environment. It was extraordinarily effective. I mean, really, it's kind of a technique that is used to combat torture, psychological torture, to keep yourself there.
Yeah. To bring yourself out of dissociative state. Sometimes being in dissociative state, though, is a good thing. And knowing what trauma is, how to recognize it. But being in a dissociative state can actually take you to a place where you don't feel as much pain, where you don't feel the psychological detrimental effects of that trauma in the moment. But then there's always that downside to being in a dissociative state. And I know that you lived in a dissociative state for so long. Can you talk about that for our audience, what it means to live in that dissociative state, or at least how it felt for you?
Sure. And I didn't realize how much I dissociated and lived in that state until I actually got to Florida. And again, I'd been healing for a year. I had learned to start grounding myself in things, but it took being there for me to understand. But I'll back up. Yeah, it's almost like I lived in an oblivion. And my memories, let me talk about the dissociation of my memories first. I didn't realize that my memory from childhood was almost like Swiss cheese. There were holes in it, but there were voids that I didn't know existed. I was not aware because I'm so smart and my memory is so insanely good that normally I remember things in such great detail. I didn't question whether I remembered childhood memories. No one else did either, because I'm always the person who remembers everything. And it was after those memories started to drop in, I started to realize, wait, there are voids where I didn't realize there were voids. And I was living in that with those holes. It's almost like you have blind spots created through those. So you're not learning to read people appropriately. You're not learning to read your environment appropriately because you don't have access to that information that would guide you.
Right. It's like we just said, you don't know what you don't know.
Exactly.
Especially in a dissociative state. You may know something, but because you go into dissociation, that may go away. That realization of reality
right.
may actually be gone for that dissociative time.
Right. Yeah. And I also have I dissociate in many ways. Intellectualization is huge for me. It is likely that I didn't get an official diagnosis, although it was working towards it, a functional neurological disorder or conversion disorder, where the brain kind of shuts down the body sometimes for perceived trauma or trauma, so that the body just can't do the thing anymore. People have been paralyzed from it And there's no medical evidence of why it's happening, even though the symptoms are very, very real. That actually complicated things in my marriage with the fact that she was poisoning me because a lot of things were blamed on that functional neurological disorder. But living in that constant dissociative state was just because of the variety of ways that my brain dissociates. I had no idea what was happening. Even after I understood dissociation and I started to understand my own dissociation, I remember going to Florida, and within the first week, I was taking walks. Usually nature helps ground people because there are so many things that stimulate your senses. It's peaceful and it's quiet. But I remember taking a walk and looking around and realizing that I'm constantly just inside my head. I kind of pull back behind my eyes, if that makes sense. And I was just constantly in my head. I'm walking and I'm like, I'm in nature. And I was just telling a story in my head. I was somewhere else. And so I started using a technique that a lot of people use for panic attacks, which is, and I don't get stuck on the numbers of what you're supposed to do, but basically you start 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and you apply a sense to each of those numbers. You find those things around you. So for example, if you start with your sense of sight, name 5 things that you can see, and it starts to ground you to reality. And then say 4 things you can smell, whatever. I don't get stuck on the numbers because that's too much. So I started using that technique just in everyday life as mindfulness. When I noticed I was pulling back behind my eyes or into my head, however you'd like to say it, I started using that grounding technique. And again, it's a muscle that flexes. And so through that, I learned to be present. And when you learn to be present and aware of what's going on around you, not only are you more aware of safety issues, but you can also more easily pull yourself out of those dissociative states.
And you mentioned how through time that can become easier if you regularly practice this. I've even heard of people who automatically go into that mode, if that's a good word to call it. I don't automatically start that process of grounding without even knowing it.
Yeah.
Because their body is sensing issues that might be triggering or activating past memories or situations that you'd been in.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really amazing when that starts to happen, when you start to do it more automatically and you see the progress of the healing, and you see that just like your body was a well-oiled machine to react to any sort of perceived trauma or triggers or things like that, your body does learn to react the other way too, in a healed way, more readily. It's still work. It'll always be work, but it gets easier, and the body does and the mind do start to do it more automatically. And it's amazing. It's been almost 2 years since I escaped domestic abuse. I've gone through a lot of different healing modalities. My whole thing is that I have learned what works for me and how I can apply it in ways that I will actually practice it. I try not to set these overarching goals for myself. I try to make sure that everything that I do to practice healing is in chunks that I can practice in an environment that I'm in. I try to be flexible, because our bodies and our minds aren't regimented like that. I just try to make sure that everything is applicable to me and not someone else.
You mentioned that you would tell us more about those horrific years of domestic abuse. I'm making a presumption here based on things we've talked about in the past and even your past episode, that there were, in that domestic abuse, there were sexual abuse aspects to that. Are you able to talk about some of that for our listeners to kind of have a reference point to when love stops and abuse starts or assault starts?
Absolutely. So unfortunately, the sexual coercion at least started immediately. I had gone to Seattle with my ex-wife, who had had a brain surgery, the same brain surgery that I would later end up having about 8 years later. I had gone to Seattle with her for a follow-up visit for her appointment for her brain surgery. And I found out later that she had called every Marriott in the area to find one that only had one bed so that she could trick me into sleeping with her. And that happened, and the relationship happened shortly thereafter. When she told me that she had done this, I thought it was cute because unfortunately Hollywood and many other things romanticize this almost Stockholm syndrome, or this, this relationship, this trauma bond with rapists, with abusers. We think that people who chase us, that's cute, and that means that they love us. And that's not true. People who hunt us do not love us in that way.
So good for you to point this out. I just know there are people in the audience who are hanging on every word at this point.
Yeah, so it was pretty immediate with my ex-wife. And then I remember flying home and she would not take no for an answer on the plane. I kept saying, no, no, no. The thing that I'd like to point out here is that this is a same-sex relationship. This is a relationship with a woman. This was not a man doing this to me. I think it's important to point out that women are completely capable of the same horrific behavior that men are. And in fact, because women are marginalized, many of them get away with it very much more readily than men. And I'm not victim blaming or anything. I'm not trying to, say women are inherently bad, but I'm saying that a lot of women do the same things that violent men do, but they get away with it because of they hide behind their marginalization.
Or even their femininity.
Correct. Often women are able to manipulate more effectively too, in my experience. And part of that is, again, hanging on to their marginalization and femininity.
And socially, we're not programmed to look for sexual assault from women.
Correct. Furthermore, I've tried to do some research on different gender dynamics in relationship and abuse and sexual assault. And when I've done so, it is so apparent. These are scholarly articles. It has been so apparent that cishet people wrote them. It disqualifies. There are nuances that are missing. In my opinion, when I'm reading this, I'm like, this is not reflective of anything I've experienced as a queer person.
I agree. Looking at it from those eyes, not being gay myself, but knowing through my experience and training and education that the abuse in the LGBTQ plus community oftentimes so much more damaging. Rape and sexual assault is damaging in and of itself, but I think there is an aspect to the LGBTQ plus community that isn't in the cis community. And I think I can safely say that exists in male-on-male sexual assault also because of the socialization and culture aspects of us in this country. What men go through is really tricky to talk about this because some people get offended by the idea that how is their sexual assault more horrific or more traumatic than mine. I'm not comparing it in the general sense. I'm comparing it in a very specific sense of how it impacts us because of our societal upbringing, our cultural programming.
Sure. It's not easy for anyone to, of course, be sexually assaulted. But when it happens to someone who is a cis male, it's, again, like you said, the socialization. There's so much shame. Men are viewed as weak if they step forward. Men are viewed as just victims, but that victim kind of just is seething for men. It's not that it's any more painful one way or the other, but the impact of the socialization, I would agree. And for non-binary people too.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that's exactly where I was going, is that there's so much commonality between male-on-male sexual assault and all of the trauma and damage that is done because of that cultural and socialization that applies equally to non-binary community and the marginalized community that we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And also people aren't looking in the LGBTQI community. They're not looking over there for abuse.
It's true.
And if you think about the fact that most sexual assaults are not reported, and I don't believe that they should have to be, but for statistic purposes, they're not reported. And if you think about the fact that male sexual abuses are really not reported, and you look at that and apply it to a same-sex gender dynamic, who knows what we're looking at?
Such a good sidetrack.
I know.
I love that. I'm really happy we went there. But if we could,
Yes.
let's go back to being stuck in a room with one bed.
Yes. My wife and I had been together for about 8 years when I started to get really sick. My health had gotten worse and worse throughout our relationship. When she and I got together in 2011, I was extraordinarily healthy, didn't keep medication in my home. I lived in a really old apartment building with steep, tall stairs. I lived on the 3rd floor, and I could carry 2 5-gallon water jugs up at one time. I was insanely healthy, so healthy, and she hated that. I'm not quite sure what was what in the beginning, but my health did start to decline very immediately. Also, she used my mental health against me, used psychiatrists and psychologists to continuously increase my drugs, my medication anytime I did something that she didn't like. she'd say, "You're crazy, go to the doctor," basically. Maybe she wouldn't use the word crazy because she was very covert. But I started getting sick immediately. I started gaining weight pretty immediately. Now, how much was cortisol from the intermittent reinforcement and different aspects of the abuse? Because cortisol causes a person to not be able to lose weight. It causes a lot of things to happen. And it also causes other hormones to have a domino effect. But how much was the cortisol and how much was her doing something to me immediately? I don't know. What I do know is that I ended up having to have a brain surgery for the same thing that she had about 8 years earlier. So as my health started to decline over the years, she suggested that I had Cushing's disease, just like she'd had before. Now, when you have a surgery for Cushing's disease, it is a brain surgery. Some people say it's brain surgery, some people don't, but it affects the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is what produces cortisol. It signals to your adrenals to produce cortisol. And so with Cushing's disease, you have a tumor or multiple tumors on your pituitary gland, which is about the size of a pea. And these tumors produce a hormone called ACTH, which that hormone will then signal the adrenals to produce cortisol. She convinced me that I had this. Now, the thing is, she'd had 75% of her pituitary gland removed years earlier, so she had access to steroids. And steroids, if you take them and you're testing for Cushing's disease, will create a false positive. She convinced me that I was too crazy to do my own pill planner, and I was taking about 20 pills a day at some point, and she was slipping in these steroids while I was testing for Cushing's disease. I had brain surgery at MD Anderson in 2020, 3 weeks before the pandemic, for no reason. My health continued to decline because if you have high cortisol, because you actually do have Cushing's disease, because it is a real and debilitating disease, or if you're slipped steroids for a long time, it affects all of your hormones, and it also has a lot of physical ramifications. There are lots of things that happen. So that was happening. But also, she started slipping arsenic to me. And it was during the pandemic when it was not safe to really go to an ER. I remember the first time that she did it. I remember how sick I got. I never have digestive issues. I never vomit. I never get an upset stomach. And all of a sudden, I had the worst stomach pain of my life. I had lots of digestive issues. So she knew that I wouldn't go to the doctor because my health had been declining. She knew I wouldn't go to the ER even though I was shaking. I was in so much pain. They learn to bank on what your reactions and your behavior will be. And it's a good plan. They're really clever with it. So I never went to the doctor for that. And anyway, time went on. She decided that we would move and we would have one vehicle, that we would go to a 1-bedroom apartment where she would work from home in the bedroom while I was sick. So I had nowhere to lay down, nowhere to sleep. Meanwhile, she's slipping me arsenic intermittently. I still don't know exactly when she was doing it. I ended up at a hematologist oncologist who decided part of the intake process is that they test you for things like heavy metal toxicities, including arsenic. And if you listen closely enough to people who abuse, they always tell on themselves. But you have to read between the lines and you can't pick up on it while you're in it, usually. So when this hematologist oncologist started testing me for these things, I have worked in the medical industry before, so I can read all of those lab requests and things. And I saw the arsenic. I saw a couple of other things that he was testing me for. She was all about me doing research for all of these things, except for when I started researching the arsenic. And she said, no, it's not that one. It's not that one. So I traced back. I followed my injuries because I have kidney damage. Now I have some weird swelling in my legs that doesn't go away, along with some other things. I traced that back. And with that comment that she made, I realized that it was arsenic. Now I was losing consciousness a lot, both because I was dissociating and arsenic. So I don't know what's what. But right before I left her, it was actually June 21st, I had gone to see a friend. It was a friend that I had known for over 20 years, who was one of the closest people to me in my life, who I loved very much. I went to see them. I spent the night at their house, and my ex-wife had hacked into my emails, my Apple text messages, all of these different things. So she knew exactly where I had gone. She was angry about it. When I came home the next day, I stood up to her for the very first time because I had been around someone who empowered me, who made me remember that I was a human and who made me feel safe. I stood up to her. I don't know what happened after that, but the next day I woke up with bruises on my inner thighs, on my calves. And I remember sitting in the bathroom and crying and trying to put my hands in these spaces that were clearly handprint bruises. And I couldn't put my hands in the position that they were in. I couldn't have done it to myself. That is the sexual assault specifically that I know of, other than coercion in the marriage. Who knows what else happened? I really have no way of knowing.
not knowing is part of the trauma. And I can well imagine the horror and the trauma and the fear you must have felt at that point in time, thinking back to all that coercion, all the times when you were unconscious, either through being drugged, being poisoned, or through dissociation and that traumatic amnesia. Reflecting on that, Cassie, must be extremely difficult for you still. How is the coping mechanism kicking in? What are you doing to even be able to sit here and talk to me about this?
I journal a lot. Something that I think that people don't know about journaling and that I think is important is that when you journal, specifically when you handwrite or when you speak something out loud, like I know there's a Gestalt form of therapy called the empty chair, where you talk to someone as if they are in an empty chair in front of you. When you do these things, you're bypassing the brain, you're tricking the brain. All the brain knows is that you're getting those things out. It thinks that you might be saying it to the person that you're writing it to. And it's specifically with handwriting because typing is more muscle memory. So I do a lot of journaling. I do a lot of talking out loud to myself because it gets it out. It processes it because these things are meant to move through our bodies. These emotions are meant to move through us, not stay inside the body. So I do a lot of that. I do a lot of breathing, mindfulness. I try to make sure that I pay attention to the fact that I have a body because I forget that. I do lots of creative things, anything to get in touch with the internal, anything to allow the internal self to express itself. And I make sure that I have solid people in my corner because you can't do all of this work on your own. You cannot. You can do a lot of internal work, but we heal when we heal together. We heal as a community because common lived experiences, we weave a fabric together and we learn from one another and we build from one another. So I do as much work as I can internally, and I ensure that I have someone solid that I can also reflect back to me, things that they see that perhaps I need to be aware of. And so I have a checks and balance system. And again, I still don't have a therapist. And I've only been doing this for under 2 years. I had no awareness of what trauma was before that. And I've done this without a therapist.
You're amazing.
Thank you.
You are amazing. And not only are you amazing for the therapy that you're giving yourself and the techniques that you're using that are helping, but you're amazing because you're here talking to a community of people who support you and who you are supporting. I am just so full of gratitude for all of what you're saying because I know there's so many in the audience who are going to just feed on what you're saying. We need this. We need to talk about this more. It's how we change culture.
It is. It is. And there are so many struggles, as I mentioned earlier, beyond just surviving sexual assault or surviving domestic violence and abuse that precipitates because of sexual assault as a child or sexual assault as an adult. I have complex PTSD, so it's really difficult for me to be in the workforce. However, unfortunately, 99% of all domestically abusive relationships involve financial abuse, and it's usually atrocious. It usually leaves the victim with nothing. And that's what happened to me. I had absolutely nothing except for a car that I inherited from my sister when she died a month before I escaped. I left my apartment with that and that only. And so there have been so many struggles since then. I haven't had a permanent address to get anything like disability or insurance. You know, I've been given poison for a long period of time and I've not had any health checkups from that. I don't know what the ramifications are of that. And I've just been traveling across the country, being transient, basically running because it's unsafe at many times for me. And there are just so many struggles. People say, well, get a job. You need an address to get a job. You need a job to get housing to get an address. Food banks often require a local ID. Most food banks do, actually. Lots of things require address. And if you don't have a local ID and you don't have money, how do you get it? In Frederick, Maryland, I was actually living temporarily on a little farm. And there was a community fridge about 20 minutes down the road that actually I could access without an ID or anything like that. But the problem was it was 20 minutes down the road and sometimes you don't have gas to go to the food pantry. Meanwhile, I'd been trying to get jobs, but again, my PTSD is so bad that it's really difficult for me to be in an environment and it's difficult for me to do online work or anything like that, at least in the traditional 9-to-5 sense. It's really difficult. So I've just been struggling, and this is a common experience. This is a very common experience. While my ex-wife has stability, has animals, has all of these things on my sister's money, and I've been running across the country. I've been very fortunate in that even being transient, I found ways to have some semblance of shelter But most people aren't that lucky. I had a large network of people that I knew many were also transient, and I'm very friendly. I make friends easily. But again, people see that wound that I display that I don't even know I display in many ways. People see that and they prey upon that because so many people are traumatized and don't even know that they have it or aren't willing to work through it themselves. We always talk about how history repeats itself and generational trauma and things like that. It crossed my mind that I almost relived my mother's entire story. In fact, I don't think I mentioned this on the last podcast episode, but the day that I escaped was July 25th, 2022. It was 11 a.m. And I know that because I stopped at my car when I got out and I took a picture of myself. I don't know why I did it, but I did. And so a couple months later, I was looking for that picture. And when I found it, I was like, whoa, that date. I had no idea what day I had escaped. I thought, whoa, that date. What does that mean? That looks very familiar. I pulled my mother's death certificate. My mom died July 25th, 1992 at 11:15 a.m. It was almost as if to say my mom had stayed a little too long, too late, and had lost her life to the same thing that nearly killed me. My father was also slowly poisoning her. And I watched that happen and I relived that very literally. Because I didn't understand what danger was. I didn't understand my past. When children experience trauma and when children experience sexual assault specifically, it's not the end of them, but we treat them like it is. We treat them like they shouldn't talk about it. We don't give them the space to have their feelings, to ask questions, to have curiosity about what's happened to them. And that's the whole problem. That is the whole problem, because children should be able to be curious and have questions about their autonomous bodies. But we don't allow that. And so when it's pushed down, you see things like my life repeating itself over and over again, repeating my mother's trauma even. And who knows what in her generational trauma was repeated. Children, it's not the end of them when they're sexually assaulted, but they need support to heal and to learn to navigate the world through this different traumatic view. If I could change anything about my past, it would be that I'd had support from adults in my life, that people had looked just a little harder when I was a child. But unfortunately, even now, I don't fit the ticket for quote unquote a homeless person or something like that. I didn't look like a trafficking victim. If you Google what a trafficking victim looks like, it's nothing like I was. I was very intelligent, graduated at the top of my class, got a college degree. No one ever knew because I didn't look downtrodden or sad. I wasn't dirty. I had my emotions well enough under control until they would explode. I was a good kid. And as far as domestic violence goes, I also didn't look like a victim. I looked like I had a doting wife. I looked like she was trying to take care of me. I looked like I just unfortunately had gotten really sick. And so when we don't address those issues of childhood sexual abuse or any kind of abuse as a child, that's when things go awry. Not because it happened, but because we force children to not be able to deal with it. We don't give them the tools to deal with it.
I am struck with the idea that with all of that, you're continuing on. You're doing the things that need to be done step by step in small increments where most people would give up. What is it inside of you, do you think, that drives you the way you're driven?
You know, I think it's a couple of things. I think that, first of all, a large part of why I've been able to heal as well as I have and do it in a self-guided way is because of the fact that I haven't been able to work, because of the fact that I've had a forced pause in life, even with other traumatic things happening, even with running, I've had this forced pause. So my healing has been able to happen naturally. It has been able to happen as my brain and my body dictate, not as some arbitrary outside therapy schedule or something like that dictates. I think that that is helpful. But the thing that keeps me going is that my entire life, I struggled with suicide attempts, suicidal ideation. I don't know how many suicide attempts I had. I had about 11 between December 2021 and July 2022 when I finally escaped domestic abuse. My friends were shocked when I made it to 30 years old. I just turned 40 last year.
Congratulations.
I turned 41 next month.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Early.
Thank you. the thing that keeps me going is the fact that for the first time in my life, I love myself. I'm learning to love myself more. I'm happy. I don't have depression even. I do not have clinical depression. I do not struggle with that. And I was diagnosed with it my entire life. Remove myself from the environment and I don't have that anymore. That's what keeps me going because there is life on the other side of all of this. It's not just for me, it's for other people too. It can be for other people. People have to be aware of the fact that they've had trauma in the first place before they can start to go through it. But the drive for me is that I understand internally how much peace I'm at now for the first time in my life. I understand how vastly different that was from any other time. I don't want my life to end now. This is the good part.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I'll be daggone if it stops now.
I love hearing that. I know people in my audience love hearing that. That is so strong.
Even without physical resources, even not knowing sometimes where I'm going to sleep from night to night, internally, I know who I am. I know who I am for the first time because when my ex-wife broke me, literally, physically, mentally, spiritually, all of the ways, I was forced to look at the pieces of myself and examine them as they laid broken at my feet. And I was forced to pick the pieces that I wanted to build myself back. And I was able to do that through the help of a community of friends who knew me before the abuse, who understood my resilience and who reminded me of that. And then I chose which pieces I would put back into myself to define myself for the first time because I had always lived under someone's thumb.
And I don't want to give any false sense of pretense here. So let's address this. Everyone has their down days.
Absolutely.
What do you do on those days, Cassie?
Well, I think it depends on what kind of day it is. I've learned to read my body. I've learned to listen to myself. That's the biggest thing. We are taught through abuse and gaslighting specifically not to trust the world as we experience it through our senses, which is why grounding is critical to reestablish reality through your senses and to trust yourself. Grounding teaches you to trust yourself and your mind. So I've learned techniques with down days. If it's something like I'm extraordinarily activated, sometimes temperature helps, like a cold ice pack on the chest or a cold shower will kind of shock your nervous system. It grounds you.
Yeah.
Again, it reminds you of your environment. So that helps if it's more of an acute anxiety or, again, my nervous system is activated. I try to keep in communication with myself, again, through journaling. Through all of these different things, I try to keep in contact with people at all times, but mainly I listen to myself and I listen to my body.
I love that because I learned probably, 15, 20 years ago about mindfulness. And I know that you mentioned mindfulness. It seems like that's a huge part of your life, even though you didn't just now say it. The things that you did say make me think mindfulness.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the other thing that I've started to do, which is part of mindfulness actually, is to tap back into my creativity. I studied photography and vocal performance music in college. So I'm a very creative person. I can pick up most artistic endeavors and do fairly well at them. And so I've started tapping back into them. And I think that that's how I deal with bad days too, is finding things that make me feel good, not that anybody else wants me to do. And I've started to learn to say no. I've started to learn that when people want to impose their ideas on me, they want me to do something that I don't want to do, I have the right to say no. And it's hard to get there. It's a long road to get there. But you know what's best for yourself. I know what's best for myself. And learning that after a lifetime of being told you're crazy and you don't know what's best for yourself, it's a journey to get there, but it's possible. And that helps through those down days. Just building a support system for yourself, a support system that's external through friends or people that you can trust, but also through supports that you've tried that work for yourself, through these techniques, these grounding techniques that I've talked about, through just trying to experience joy. It's not about one technique. It's about the cultivation and the accumulation of many techniques that work for you in specific moments, because one technique is not going to work the whole time.
I know there's some in my audience who are saying in their minds, what the heck is mindfulness? And I have my definition, but I love how articulate you are. It's one of the things about you that struck me from when we first started communicating a year ago. Are you willing to tell our audience your definition of mindfulness and how it really is an amazing healing aspect? And not only a healing aspect, it heals the past, but it also, from everything I've read and everything I've studied about mindfulness, keeps us well.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about mindfulness for us.
So, mindfulness, in my definition, is the attempt to reconnect with your surroundings and to reconnect with yourself, but to do so on a kind of a constant level instead of a more acute level. To me, it's kind of like taking an antidepressant where you take that constantly instead of taking like a panic attack pill, like
Sure.
a Xanax or something like that. So with mindfulness, basically you're taking a moment, especially with trauma, we get stuck in these cycles of doing things and we don't pay attention to what we're doing. You know, we get dressed in the morning, we take a shower. We don't think about the fact of how the water feels on our skin. We ignore our body. Mindfulness gives us a moment and a point of contact to reconnect to our mind and our body and our sense of self. And you do so through your environment and through your senses. So for example, when you take a shower, you're already in the shower. Perhaps instead of just imagining what's going to happen throughout your day, you pay attention to the sensations that you feel in your body. You smell the different scents in the shower. You feel the water. You feel the temperature. You notice different things. And it's a way of living like that more constantly that keeps you constantly grounded to your reality. It calms your nervous system because your nervous system, your mind isn't wandering somewhere, ruminating on trauma or ruminating on stress or anything like that. It keeps you in the present moment instead of the past already happened. We can't change it. The future is honestly imaginary at this point. All you have is your present. But trauma teaches us to branch off into the past and the future and to live there because we have to anticipate what's going to happen next based on our past to make sure we're safe. Mindfulness is a muscle flex. It flexes that muscle of grounding yourself and to remembering where you are. And it makes it harder for you to gaslight. When you know where you are and who you are, it's hard for people to gaslight you.
So true. I remember when I first started learning about mindfulness, like I said, it's probably been 20 years. And after it was described to me very similarly to what you just said, I started asking myself questions. And I think this is a great way for people to learn what mindfulness is and start practicing it. You've mentioned some great ways. Being in the shower is one of them. But I'll ask myself questions. How does your left toe feel right now? And it actually focuses your mind to that body part. And you're like, oh, yeah, I need to change position because really my whole foot, not just my left toe, but my whole foot is not comfortable. So I'm going to change that. And when you start making yourself comfortable because you're asking yourself, how does this feel? How does that feel? Where are you? What are you smelling? What are you seeing? It does. It takes you exactly like you just said into a world of self-awareness that actually calms you.
It does.
It's so powerful. It's medicine.
It is.
And it actually puts you into an awareness state that, from what I remember, it activates the hippocampus in ways that make less likely to develop things like dementia, maybe ultimately Alzheimer's, or at least slow that process down because your brain is actually being forced to think in different ways. But that force is so healing. It's not like a detrimental forcing yourself. It's like as I just said, it's a medicinal awareness of putting yourself in a different place that lowers the cortisol and lowers those other detrimental chemicals in our bodies. Learning mindfulness techniques and becoming more mindful of yourself actually does change your entire chemical makeup and puts your brain in a different place.
I love the way you describe it as medicinal because that is absolutely what it is. I took psych meds for a long portion of my life, and I'm not suggesting that anyone stop taking psych meds because I think that they're a great tool, but I take nothing. I've survived all of this trauma and I take no medication because I've worked so hard because I've had the opportunity. It's strange to say I've had the opportunity to work this hard on healing when I'm literally houseless, homeless. But you know, again, sometimes you have to give up the things, the comfort to see yourself and to be the best version of yourself. And I'm not glorifying that. I think that in this society, we glorify struggle, not hard work. And I think that that's very unfortunate. So I'm not glorifying this struggle, but I am glorifying myself and the way that I have learned to heal. And it is possible for other people too. Even if you don't have resources, there are ways. You just have to dig.
Those are some powerful words. Those are some healing words right there. Again, so impressed with how articulate you are and your intelligence level. You are an amazing intellect.
Thank you.
And I think people need to know that about you too.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
It's just an amazing aspect of who Cassie is.
That's very healing for me to know because I spent 10 years allowing my ex-wife to she had trained me to say that my intelligence was subpar, that
God.
I was not intelligent at all. 10 years, I was trained to do it myself as a way to silence me. And before that, I had defined myself by my intellect, which was also detrimental, but it means a lot to hear that. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're more than welcome, because it's so true. And so I think evident in the things you talk about and the way you're articulate. It's exciting to listen to you and be around you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
And I hope people reach out to you and want to communicate with you.
Yes, I would welcome that.
That'd
Absolutely.
be awesome.
Yeah.
And you may have to do that right now through me, because Cassie has eliminated herself from social media for the time being.
Yes.
And if you do want to communicate with Cassie, please email me. Yeah, let's stay in touch with Cassie.
Yes, I'd welcome that. Yes.
That's cool. Cassie, thank you so much again for being here. I've said this multiple times during this conversation with you, that this is going to help hundreds, thousands, maybe even millions of people throughout time and perpetuity, because this will be available forever, I hope. Your willingness to be as transparent as you are, to be as open with some really difficult things that most people won't talk about, your willingness to do that and go there is healing to me as a host, but I know there are just so many people who are going to benefit from this. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And let's plan on doing this again.
I would love to. I would be honored.
We will stay in touch. I don't even feel like I have to ask you what you're going to do to take care of yourself after this episode, because I think you've already told us.
Yes.
I know that you are going to take really good care of yourself.
I am.
Thank you for that.
Yes, of course. And I hope everyone else does too.
Me too. Okay.
Yes.
See you next time. That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I want to give a huge shout out and my deep appreciation to Cassie Nicholas for being with me on this show. Cassie showed a tremendous amount of strength and bravery in appearing on this episode. Thank you, Cassie. Your courage and transparency haven't gone unnoticed nor unappreciated. I hope each of you, my listeners, gained some insight, strength, and great advice on moving forward in your own healing journey. Cassie is a powerhouse of knowledge and great advice as we move forward on our healing path, and she's doing a great deal in helping provide justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. If any of you want to communicate with Cassie, please forward your emails to me, and I'll make sure she gets them. Thank you again for being part of my listening audience. If you haven't already subscribed to the SAS podcast, please do so and leave a rating. I would also appreciate it if you would tell everyone you know about the Sexual Assault Survivor Stories podcast, especially family and friends, as it is important for this podcast to grow in order to provide a learning avenue and a safe healing place. It's also a great way for you to do your part in providing justice to victims and survivors. Another way is to start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. Be sure to tune in again next Tuesday as I bring you another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. We'll see you next week.